Hey everybody, welcome to our class again on Unlocking God's Story. We are working on Bible study methods, how to read and really understand God's Word. Thank y'all for being here again today. I'm sorry that I can't be with you. I needed to go with Melanie to go visit her family. So please pray for us as we're visiting her mom and dad, and pray for a safe trip back as well. But I'm really glad that Cesar is able to join us, and I want to thank him for doing so. He's already walked through kind of a review of where we are. We're in interpretation and we're talking about genre, and we're going to cover today the four remaining genres that of the six major types within the Bible. So I want to do a quick review on what genre is. You remember this definition from Merriam-Webster. It's a category of artistic, musical, or literary composition characterized by a particular style, form, or content. What that means is that we can organize things that we read according to the features, the content, the style, etc. And the goal is twofold. We want to first identify what we are reading, because as you know, the Bible is a big mix of different writings. It's got lots of different things in it, and so identifying them can help us as we think through what we see and as we digest it and as we seek to understand it. But then, perhaps more to the point, knowing what we're reading then helps us with interpretation. So you remember that we're in the second part of our Bible study methods. We are going through interpretation. So genre helps us understand what we are reading. We ask what the text says. That is sort of the role of identifying the genre. And then we are now asking what it means. In other words, how does understanding what we are reading, the genre, the type of literature, help us then understand how to interpret it, and ultimately then to put it into practice. And so our goal today will be to look at the four remaining genres. Last week we covered narrative and poetry, and as Cesar has reviewed with you, narrative appeals to the imagination and poetry to the emotions. We're going to look at wisdom, prophecy, exposition, and apocalyptic this morning. And what we're going to do is I'm going to give some explanation of each type. And then I'm going to ask Cesar to look at a particular example with you and kind of talk through how it works. And so we'll cover the four remaining types of genre by following that particular method. So the first one that we want to look at is wisdom. Now, when we think about wisdom, it's really important to define it, because sometimes the world defines wisdom in a way that doesn't really fit with the way the Bible does. And so if we were to be pretty general, we might say that wisdom is having an attitude, belief, or action that is appropriate for the situation. For example, if you are dealing with a friend and you're having an argument, a wise response would be to talk with them, to show that you care for them, and to deal with the issue directly and not sweep it under the rug and gossip about them. Wisdom dictates that we act certain ways that are appropriate. Now, in the Bible, wisdom really focuses on how do we act in accordance with what God desires for us. There is wisdom based upon the way He has made the world, the way everything works, based upon His plan and purposes, based upon His character, etc. So biblical wisdom is asking us to have an attitude, belief, or action that's appropriate for the way God would want us to act in a particular situation. Now, in terms of the genre, we have to recognize that every culture has proverbs and sayings that sort of encompass this common folk wisdom. We have those in our English vocabulary. For example, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. That means that it's much better to prevent a problem before it starts than to have to deal with it on the back end. In other languages and cultures, they have different proverbs and things of that nature. So you're familiar with this kind of common folk wisdom. But when we think about this from the standpoint of the Bible, what we're dealing with is instead general timeless truths about who God is and how He works and how the world works that ground us in reality. It appeals to common sense, but specifically common sense filtered through God's designs and plans. So the biblical wisdom will take the same shape that we see. For example, there are sayings, there are images that are pretty common, and it does appeal to our common sense, but it appeals to common sense filtered through what God desires for us. And so that's what makes biblical wisdom really fun and interesting to examine. So there's three main things that we are going to try to pay attention to as we think about biblical wisdom. The first is, remember that biblical wisdom presents an ideal picture. It does not deal with all of the particulars of your situation or your neighbor's situation. It presents an ideal picture of what God desires for us. And so what that means is that part of understanding wisdom is to recognize what that ideal picture is, and then to see how it should be put into practice in our own lives. So, for example, the book of Proverbs will very often talk about someone who is blessed because they are following the Lord. And the author of Proverbs understands that life is difficult, that occasionally we might have trouble following the Lord in one certain situation. But the purpose is to present this ideal picture so that we can then measure our lives against that wisdom and then act accordingly in response. So wisdom will always focus on an ideal picture. It doesn't ever really get into the particulars of day-to-day life or the particulars of your situation. And so that means that wisdom does not address what we might call outliers. Very often what you'll find is that when you come to wisdom, you will think, you know what, I get it, I understand how this works, but what about my situation that has this really unusual circumstance? Well, the Bible doesn't really address those particular things. Our responsibility is to take the ideal picture and then to put it into practice in our particular situation. So wisdom does not cover exceptional situations or exceptional circumstances. It looks at the ideal picture, and then our responsibility is to say, how should we act in our particular situation in light of that ideal picture? And then what you'll also notice is that there's a lot of overlap with poetry. We talked about poetry last week, and remember we talked about how Hebrew poetry is parallel. It puts things side by side, and biblical wisdom will oftentimes do that as well. So there's a lot of overlap with poetry, but the key will be think about how this juxtaposition of ideas works in wisdom to help you understand better the ideal picture and how you should behave in your particular situation. So as a whole, remember that wisdom is presenting an ideal picture. It doesn't deal with the particulars of your particular case or with outliers. It only deals with the main ideal picture. And there's overlap with poetry that helps us dig into how is it structured and how can we think more carefully about the ideal picture that it presents. All right, what I'm going to do now is pass it off to Cesar, and he is going to look at Proverbs 26:14 and then Proverbs 26:4 and 5 to show you an example of how wisdom works within the Bible. So I will let him stop the video, and then he can restart when y'all are done with your discussion. Okay, next we're going to talk about prophecy. Prophecy is a really neat genre in the Bible because it connects us to something that's very true about God. One thing that we know about God is that He is omniscient. What we mean by omniscient is that God knows everything. There is not a single thing that God does not know. He knows all things past. He knows all things present. He knows all things future. He even knows all potential things, if you want to even get really technical about it. And sometimes for the benefit of His people, God will reveal what He knows in each of these areas and how they connect and how they impact our particular lives. So in other words, prophecy taps into God's omniscience as the prophet is able to explain something either in the past, present, or future, and then encourage God's people as a result. Prophecy reveals truth and reveals the world from God's viewpoint, from His omniscient viewpoint, and therefore it appeals to hope. When we think about prophecy, we ought to think think about how we can have hope in God and hope in the future because of God's omniscience and his omnipotence and his sovereign control over everything. Sometimes when we think about prophecy, we think about it from the standpoint of just knowledge. Ooh, we want to know about the future. But that's not a biblical model of prophecy. Prophecy appeals to hope, and it helps us realize that God's in control, and occasionally he will let us know a little bit about the future just to remind us that he knows about it, he's in control, and we can therefore live appropriately as a result and live in hope. Now, there's four main interpretive points that we have to think about here with prophecy. The first is that biblical prophets have a clear call to the past revelation of God to ground present faithfulness. See, we oftentimes have made the mistake of thinking that prophecy is only about the future, when in reality, most of the prophets will look back to what God has talked about in the past and then call people to live appropriately in the present. So prophecy is oftentimes about a clear call, a clear reminder of what God has done, what God has revealed in the past, and how we should live in light of that today. There's also the present issue at stake of obedience, of faithfulness, of patience under trial. The prophets don't always talk about the future. They oftentimes encourage people in the present because we know what God has said in the past and we know how it applies to us right now. So we then can be obedient, we can be faithful, we can be patient when things are difficult. It's not only about knowing the future. It's oftentimes about how are we going to live today in light of what God has revealed to us. Now, the third point is, yes, there is a future focus. So oftentimes prophecy will look towards the future and it will be a clear understanding of what God is going to do or how God is going to work. But we have to remember that prophecy is not solely future focused within the Bible. It oftentimes shows a connection, and this is the fourth interpretive point. It shows a connection between how the past, the present, and the future are all under God's control. And because of what God revealed in the present, we can be obedient. Of what God has revealed in the past, we can be obedient now. Because of what he's going to do in the future, we can have hope now. So there's this nexus of past, present, and future in prophecy that's meant to really give us encouragement and to help us live in hope. So the key thing to remember is that the prophecy in the Bible is not only about the future, it's also about what God has revealed in the past and how that affects us in the present. It's about how we can have hope now based upon what God is going to do in the future, and how all three of those things connect in the biblical revelation that we have in front of us. Now, the example that Cesar is going to talk through is the book of Habakkuk. So I'll let him pause the video, and he's going to give you a quick overview of the book of Habakkuk, and you can then discuss how it functions as prophecy within the biblical text. Next, we're going to discuss exposition. Now, I love exposition because I love a good argument. Who doesn't love a good argument? Now, by argument, I don't mean two people getting angry at each other and saying harsh words. What I mean is an argument that explains something. That's what I do all day long, as I am in the business of explaining the biblical text, of expositing it to my students, and I love that. I think that's a beautiful thing. When we can explain truth in a coherent, logical way, we are doing a good work because we're helping people understand God's revelation. So exposition then appeals to the mind. It appeals to our rational side, our logical side, and it helps us understand how truth is connected together and then how it works appropriately. And the Bible is filled with exposition. A lot of Jesus's teaching is exposition. A lot of Paul's writings are exposition. It is a beautiful, wonderful part of the Bible, and it appeals to the mind because it presents truth in a coherent way and encourages us as a result. So there's three main things that we want to think through when we deal with exposition. The first would be tracing the argument. Now again, here I don't mean an argument where two people are angry and they're yelling at each other. I mean a logical, coherent argument that takes you from point A to point B to point C and then makes a deduction D that we can then hold as true. And so part of our responsibility when we look at exposition is to figure out how the author has constructed the argument, to trace the logical flow, if you will. You remember that when we dealt with language, we talked about how clauses will flow in a paragraph and how they can have a function to show you the argument. That's exactly what we are talking about here. So tracing the argument will help us understand the big picture of what the author is arguing, and it will help us see how it all fits together. And this is where an outline can really help you. Many Bibles will have outlines of particular books, and you can see then how the author has constructed that argument. And that's really, really helpful in understanding the flow of what the author is getting at and what he actually means. The second thing that we would think through is logic. Now, what I mean here is not necessarily a formal logic that we might have studied in college, like if-then statements. What I mean is how the argument fits together. For example, the author may make a statement, and then he might give 3 supporting arguments, and then he might make a conclusion. That's a logical argument. Or the author may make an assertion, and then he gives you a cause or a basis for that assertion. Or an author may make a inference, and then he shows you the explanation of why that inference holds. Now, some of this overlaps again with what we talked about with language, because oftentimes we use language to show logic. We will use words like because, so, therefore, and words like that. But the argument is the whole point that the author is trying to make, and the logic is how the argument fits together. So it's sort of like getting into the smaller pieces of what the author is arguing. So basically, logic will explain how the argument is put together and how it actually works. The third thing that we want to do when we look at exposition is to find the propositions. And what I mean by this is to find the crisp statements of spiritual truth that the author has either stated explicitly or implicitly that undergirds the argument. So for example, if you look at a passage and you talk about how God is saving us through Christ or something to that effect, there's a couple of propositions there. There's a proposition that God is a saving God. He's in the business of bringing salvation. There's a proposition that Christ is the means by which that salvation comes. And then we are the recipients. So all of those propositions are crystallizations, if you will, summations of the truth that we see in the argument, and that helps us understand what the author is trying to argue. What you'll see is that all 3 of these things, the argument, the logic, and the propositions, relate to one another. The argument is based upon logic, and it consists of prepositions. In order to understand the argument, you have to understand the logic and the prepositions. It's sort of like a circle of interpretation as we go through an expositional argument. So a lot of what we've already discussed in terms of language and observation will help us here. But at this level, what we're doing is we're putting it together in a holistic way so that we can really restate clearly what the author is arguing as part of the meaning. So the example that Cesar is going to work through with you to help you understand how exposition works is Ephesians 2, 1 through 10. It's a great passage. You probably already know several verses out of it, but what I want you to discuss is how the whole part of it fits together. See where the author, for example, changes from one topic to another and the relationship of those changes, and maybe come up with some good propositions about the truth that you see represented there. Lastly, we're going to talk about apocalyptic. Now, apocalyptic is an interesting word. It basically comes from a Greek word which means to reveal or to disclose. So at its root, what apocalyptic is doing is revealing something to us about God's world, the spiritual world around us, or things that we might not otherwise know. You have to admit, we all wonder about the spiritual realm. We would have to acknowledge as believers that there is this physical world around us, but there's also a spiritual world in which God is at work. And oftentimes, apocalyptic will show the reality of that realm. And so apocalyptic appeals to our sense of wonder. It helps us realize that, the physical world around us is not all there is. God is at work in some wonderful and mighty ways to help us understand his plans and his purposes. And so there's 3 main interpretive points that are worthwhile to discuss. Apocalyptic is very future focused. This kind of contrasts a little bit with prophecy. When we talk about prophecy, prophecy is not only future focused, but apocalyptic is almost uniformly so. So in in one sense, there's an overlap with prophecy, but in another sense, there's a distinction because apocalyptic is really looking forward to the future, what God is going to do in the spiritual realm, and how that then impacts us as believers who follow Him. And apocalyptic has a strong reliance upon visions. When you read, for example, the book of Revelation, what you see is that it's a series of visions in which the author, John, sees things that God is revealing to him, and they are quite fantastic. They are amazing visions. They are sometimes scary visions that are very hard to understand. So when you think about this, it's not really important that you pinpoint exactly what the referent of this vision is, but it's rather important for you to think about big picture archetypes. That's a technical word for a very common image or vision. A great example is Revelation chapter 12, where there's a dragon. Well, that's an archetypal image for an enemy of God, and so it's a way of understanding that the visions are not necessarily working at a particular level, but at a general level to help you understand the realities that are being explained there. And the key goal is to ask and answer the question of how is God at work? We sometimes get a little tripped up over apocalyptic because we spend so much time on the visions that we forget the big picture, that God is at work and He is defeating evil. He is bringing salvation to His people. So reminding ourselves of those things when we read apocalyptic is really helpful for getting the main point of what the author is trying to say. Now, that's not to say that the visions aren't important, but it's just to say that we need to make sure we don't overemphasize them and imagine that every little thing in the vision refers to something in the current world around us. It's more to keep our eye on the big picture. What's God doing? How is He doing it? And how should I then live as a result? So apocalyptic is one of those genres that's kind of challenging to think through. Cesar is going to talk you through Revelation chapter 4, and it'll be a good discussion about how it's future focused, what kind of vision you're seeing, and what does it show you about how God is at work in this particular section of Scripture. So after this discussion, that'll be the end of the class. So I will go ahead and sign off. Thank you, Cesar, for guiding the class, and thank y'all for being here, and I look forward to being with you next week.